Okay, we're going to look at how to simplify a square root. And first, we're going to make a list of numbers, which are called perfect squares. 2 times 2, that's 4. 3 times 3, that's 9. 4 times 4, that's 16. 5 times 5, that's 25. 6 times 6, and so forth. And we're going to go to 100 when we do that. Okay, so those are a list of perfect squares. We're going to use those to help us simplify square roots. So you're going to see the verb simplify. Now, when you see the word simplify, that never means change it to a decimal. So we're not just going to simply stick that in the calculator and write down what the calculator tells us. We're instead going to write it in simpler terms. Okay, so as an example, simple example, the square root of 8. All right, so what we're going to do here, again, it's not just do square root of 8 on the calculator and write down a decimal. We're going to look for a number up here that goes into 8. Now, when we do this, we want to go big number down. We don't want to go small number up, and we'll see why in just a minute. But for this one, it's pretty simple. The only number here that's going to go into 8 has got to be 4. All right, all the other numbers are bigger than 8. So what I do is write 4. Okay, and then I'm going to divide 8 by 4, which is 2. Okay, so I've written a single square root into 2 different square roots. Square root of 8 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Well, the square root of 4, the first number should come from this list because you can take the square root of that and it not be a decimal. The square root of 4 is just plain old 2. And the square root of 2, well, that's not from the list. That would make a decimal. And remember, when we're simplifying, we don't want to write decimals. So 2 square root of 2 is how I'll leave my answer. Okay? So looking at the second example, let's look at the square root of 72. I think all the numbers actually are smaller than 100 on our assignment number 1. So you may not even need some of these bigger numbers, but you still look for them. Now, the reason I said earlier, don't go this way is because 4 goes into lots of things, but we want to make sure you get the biggest number that goes into it, the biggest number from this list, not the smaller one, because that does cause trouble if we don't get the biggest one. So I'm going to go backwards. 100 is too big to go into 72. 81 is too big. 64 is less than 72, but it doesn't go in there evenly, nor does 49. But if you take your calculator, if you need to, and divide 72 divided by 36, that does work. So 36 is better than 4 here. So we want to make sure, again, they go this way, go down, not up. Don't start with 4, start with 100 or go backwards. 36 goes into 72 2 times. And just coincidence that it's 2. Yeah, it's not always going to be 2. But 36 times 2 is 72. Okay, so the square root of 36 is 6. Now, I didn't say it for number 1, but make sure you take the square root off of there because we're actually performing that operation. Okay, so this would be wrong. You don't want to leave that on there. Make sure it comes off. Okay, so it's just plain 6, and then you don't do anything with 2. Because again, simplify, don't write a decimal. So 6 times the square root of 2. Okay, so let's look at a couple other examples. You're sometimes going to see something negative, and it's an easy fix. Let's take, for example, the square root of negative 48. All right? Again, don't start with a 4. 4 goes into 48, but it's not the biggest. So we'll go backwards. Too big, too big, too big, too big. 36 is less than 48, but it doesn't go in there. If you do 48 divided by 36, that's a decimal. Same thing here. But 16 does go in there. So what it's going to be is 16 and 3. Now, technically, there's a negative somewhere. I'm just going to leave it right here. What's the square root of 16? The square root of 16 is 4. But with a negative, you have to put an I. Okay, now why is that? Well, you don't have to worry about too much. because it ends up not being a huge deal as far as the background part. But I is equal to the square root of -1. So we'll talk more about that later. But all you have to know for this assignment is if you see a negative, you're just going to put an I right there. And again, square root of 3 does not work out. Makes a decimal. We're simplifying. We don't write decimals. Last thing I'll mention is sometimes you just happen to get one of these numbers right away. Okay, 81. What's the biggest number up here goes in 81? Well, 81. 81 is on the list. So if that happens, there's not a lot to do. You just do square root of 81. That's 9. And remember, if you see a negative, just write an I. Whether or not you remember this or not is not a big deal. As long as you see that negative, make sure you put an I there. Okay? And that's it. Simplifying the square roots.